Well, good evening, and thank you very much for coming. I'm doing double duty this evening as your initial host and also running cameras in the back, so forgive me if I'm walking back and forth. Welcome to this Historically Speaking, joint undertaking between the St. Mary's County Historical Society and our good friends here at the college and the Center for the Study of Democracy. My name is Peter Laporte. I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society. We, the Historical Society, initiated this series of lectures and discussions back in 2020 at the height of COVID, and its purpose is to bring attention to the political, legal, social, cultural, religious aspects of this county and Southern Maryland, and particularly the legacy from this county and Southern Maryland as it applies to Maryland and the whole of the country. We invite scholars, researchers, and informed citizens to share with us their understandings and their impressions of these topics starting here in Southern Maryland. All of the conversations are video recorded, as will be tonight's, and they're available for viewing on our website at the Historical Society, www.stmaryshistory.org. This evening marks the fourth Historically Speaking undertaken in partnership with the Center, and past events that Dr. Uguez and I have collaborated on began indeed in 2020 with what's his name? I forgot. Say that again? Judge Friedman, Dan Friedman of the Maryland Special Court of Appeals, Court of Special Appeals, speaking to his remote as well as present audience on who came first, the state declarations of rights in the Revolutionary era. That was followed by talk on Voices of the Civil War with historian Charles Mitchell from the Maryland Historical Society. In June of this year, in this very room, as a matter of fact, Dr. Laura Masur of the Catholic University of America presented a thoughtful and quite in-depth presentation entitled Plantation as Mission, American Indians, Enslaved Africans, and Jesuit Missionaries in Maryland. Most engrossing topic. And this past September, we presented a talk called The Role of Children in the Colonial Chesapeake with Miss Catherine Dye, a 2017 graduate in anthropology from this very college. St. Mary's County Historical Society is a member-driven organization headquartered up in Leonardtown in historic Tudor Hall. If you're not a member, please consider becoming one. And if you're a student, we're looking all the time for interns and volunteers. So if you're interested, please interrupt me at the end of this evening. And if you'd like to know more about what we do, our publications, and the types of activities in which we engage, also please don't hesitate to ask. And with that, let me turn this over to our moderator, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Center for the Study of Democracy, Dr. and Professor Antonio Uguez Jr. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Just to clarify one thing, I'm not in history. I can't take credit for that, but I am in political science. So, fortunately or unfortunately, but in any event. We appreciate the collaboration with the St. Mary's County Historical Society, and the Center is eager to continue that collaboration with our event tonight. As Peter mentioned, I am the director of the Center for the Study of Democracy. I am a professor here at St. Mary's College in the Department of Political Science and Public Policy. And as part of that, we put on events like this discussion tonight, this panel discussion. Before we enter and present our guest for tonight, I'd like to open our event by offering an example of how St. Mary's College of Maryland continues to work toward acknowledging the truth in our history which is consistent with the mission of the Center for the Study of Democracy. Last year, the college initiated a land acknowledgement and pledge to be read at the beginning of each of our events and to be displayed throughout our campus. And so we'll begin with that tonight. We acknowledge that the land on which we are learning, working, and gathering today is the ancestral home of the Yakomiko and Piscataway peoples. We also acknowledge that St. Mary's City was partly built and sustained by enslaved people of African descent. Through this acknowledgement, we recognize these communities and all those who have been displaced and enslaved through colonization. Given the unique importance of the land on which we sit, and given the unique educational mission of St. Mary's College of Maryland as the National Public Honors College, we pledge to continue to unearth and understand these historic realities so that they inform all of our work. We also pledge to work tirelessly in making our institution more accessible, inclusive, and equitable, especially for those populations most affected by societal inequities. We do this with the understanding that by supporting and learning from all of our diverse communities, we build a more sustainable future for all. Again, it's an honor to welcome you this evening. The center has at its mission, its core mission is to study issues associated with democracy, liberty, and justice, both at home and abroad. But we're also engaged in activities that shed light on historical realities and legacies for St. Mary's County, or Maryland, but all of our country and throughout the world. And so we're happy to be able to provide this opportunity to present this panel discussion along with the St. Mary's County Historical Society. It's my hope that tonight's panel discussion will help us pursue the goals and the missions of our two organizations by exploring how our understanding of racial identity has evolved over time. Our purpose here is not to rewrite or to reinterpret history. Instead, we hope to gain a greater appreciation of this social construction that is race, and how racial identity has changed over time, and what that means for us today in this historic place that is St. Mary's City. So with us tonight, we have three faculty experts that I'm confident will be able to address some of these questions and lead us in an engaging and informative conversation. First off, we have Dr. Gary Denny, who is an associate professor of history here at St. Mary's College. Dr. Denny obtained his PhD in African history at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He is a former speechwriter for Nelson Mandela and has lectured widely on liberation rhetoric in South Africa. He is a founding member of the Africa and African Diaspora Studies at St. Mary's College, and he teaches courses in African Diaspora Studies, African History, Caribbean History, and American Slave Studies. Dr. Denny has also developed an expertise in writing Caribbean histories for a general public, and we are honored to have him with us tonight. Dr. Denny, thank you for joining us. Also with us is Dr. Philip Levy. Dr. Levy is a professor of history at the University of South Florida. He received his PhD in history at the College of William and Mary. Dr. Levy has a long-standing interest in places and how they work and how they connect people. He has done extensive field research across colonial sites in the greater Chesapeake region, in particular in Virginia, including sites connected to George Washington. And he is an expert on early American history, public history, historical archaeology, and early colonial America. Welcome, Dr. Levy. Also with us is Dr. Julie King. Dr. King has several years has over 30 years experience studying, writing, and teaching about historical archaeology and Chesapeake history and culture. She is a foremost expert on these issues. She's held fellowships with Harvard University's Dumbarton Oaks, the Virginia Historical Society, and the Winterthur Museum, and has received major grants from the National Endowment for Humanities and many other awards. In particular, she was awarded the J.C. Harrington Award in recognition of her scholarly contributions to the discipline. Her current research focuses on indigenous history and colonialism in the Chesapeake region. Welcome, Dr. King. So tonight we'll begin tonight with some opening remarks by our panelists. I will then present a couple of questions to them to start us off, and then we'll open it up to the audience for your questions. And the hope, again, is that we have a conversation, not simply just a lecture, but a conversation between our panelists and our audience here tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Denny.
Why should I be the first? Good night, everyone. And I'm quite happy to be here. I should tell you that I came in from the Caribbean last night. I arrived in my house by 1 o'clock this morning, but I'm happy to be here. And the subject that the subject line or the subject sentence that I received when I was invited to be here was about how do we, understand, the transformation in racial identity over time, and so on. And I'm okay. How do I answer that question, and so on? And I have here with me a book, and the book is called "Many Thousands Gone" by Professor Ira Berlin, the late Ira Berlin, the first 2 centuries of slavery in North America. The book is about 500 pages long, but I'm only going to read the first page. Okay, and I will read this first page to you because it seems to me it answers the question. Okay, and I will have some things to say about it as well. But it has informed some of the ways in which I look at the history of race and identity, not just in North America, but throughout the hemisphere. Okay, and what I actually would like to speak about as I direct you to Professor Berlin's work is the notion that race is invented. Okay, and so we need to be able to historicize that. And racial slavery is also an invention. Okay, so those are the 2 things I want to get to, and perhaps hopefully I can get to some of the stuff that that Julie has been quite an expert about a woman called Nellie, the Irish woman who married a black man, and that creates all kinds of issues that I want to get to as well in trying to engage Berlin's position that we have to see race as a historical construction, and this is quite kind of interesting as well because I'm listening to to Tony, and Tony says that race is a social construction. Okay, Berlin has something to say about that, so listen carefully. Okay, first page. Of late, it has become fashionable to declare that race is a social construction. That's the first sentence. In the academy, this precept has gained universal and even tiresome assent. As geneticists and physical anthropologists, we replace outmoded classifications of humanity with new ones drawn from recent explorations of the genome. But while the belief that race is socially constructed has gained a privileged place in contemporary scholarly debates, it has had few practical battles. Few people believe it. Fewer act on it. The new understanding of race has changed behavior little, if at all. Perhaps this is because the theory is not quite right. Race is not simply a social construction. It is a particular kind of social construction, a historical construction. Indeed, like other historical constructions, the most famous, of course, being class, it cannot exist outside of time and place. To follow Edward Thompson's celebrated discussion of class, race
is also, quote, a fluency which evades analysis if we attempt to stop it dead at any given moment and atomize its structure, end of quote. Race, no less than class, is the product of history, and it only exists on the contested social terrain in which men and women struggle to control their destinies. The reluctance to embrace the new understanding of race as socially constructed derives neither from a commitment to an older biological classification system, which in truth is no better understood than the neurogenetics, nor from a refusal to acknowledge the reality of an ideological construct. Indeed, it derives from the failure to demonstrate how race is continually redefined, who does the defining, and why. That's sufficient from Berlin. But it's a 500-page text. You got to do the rest. Okay. Now, the notion that race is a historical construction and that it is continually being redefined, it allows us to ask the question, when does race come into existence? When does race-based slavery come into existence? And how do they change over time? Okay. And in the instance of North America, and if we're looking at Maryland and so on, Maryland law defines slavery in 1664. That's the first time we actually have, Maryland law making the case that, that there is such a thing as slavery, and which would be, directed at, people of African descent. But in fact, the enslavement of black people within Maryland was taking place at least since the 1640s. So the law follows practice. Okay. Secondly, by 1664, we already have 200 years of black enslavement. First beginning with the Portuguese, taking an African from West Africa in 1441, taking that African to Europe before Columbus gets here in 1492. And then, of course, the Spaniards who arrive here long before the English get to North America, the Spaniards would begin that traffic in enslavement in South America. So we have a 200 years knowledge and practice of enslavement that when in Maryland and in Virginia and in New York and these other parts of North America, we see slave laws being written identifying Africans as a persons to be enslaved. It isn't happening right at that moment because they have some sudden insight that blacks should be slaved. It's a 200 years process where they're, receiving information, exchanging knowledge, engaging in all kinds of conversations and practices with Spaniards, French, Portuguese, over 200 years. Okay, and so at the heart of the invention of race-based slavery is the American experience. American more broadly defined as North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. Because slavery is not new. In 1441, slavery isn't new in 1664. Slavery is several thousand years old. The Romans enslaved tens of thousands of people. All across Europe, this had been going on for thousands of years. And race as a specific concept did not exist. In fact, the favorite slaves for the Germans, for the Romans, were blue-eyed Germans. Those were their favorite. And if you lost in battle, in war, you're likely to be enslaved. That is simply how slavery proceeded. So what happened in North America and South America and the Caribbean is that we have a new concept introduced into an older practice where skin pigmentation becomes the justification for the enslavement of other human beings. But slavery itself, as a specific phenomena, had been going on for thousands of years. So that's what we have new. And so race emerges only when slavery emerges as a justification as to why Africa, why black people. And part of the answer, of course, is that it has nothing to do with skin color in and of itself. It has to do with the fact that if you are the stranger, if you are the outsider, if you are the persons without access to legal protections, then you are the ones who are most easily enslaved. That had been true for thousands of years. It remained true then. But for the persons who are in the business of creating justifications, what we have is a new one emerging, that to explain why Africans, pigmentation identifies the outsider, and the slave is always the outsider. And so pigmentation allows for permanent outsiderness. You would forever be the outsider because your skin color keeps you in that fashion, and so on. But then we have complications. What if there's children born between someone black and someone is white? In furthermore, how are we to determine how the status is propagated over time? And this becomes quite interesting out of some of the work that Julie did, because Nellie, the Irish woman, a white woman, had the temerity to marry a black man, and I think he was a slave.
He was.
She marries a black man, and well, this is a problem. What becomes of the children? And the elites, the powers to be at the time, decide those children should be slaves. The children of a white woman would be enslaved. In fact, they would remain enslaved throughout her life, and her grandchildren would remain enslaved, because about 100 years later, we still see cases which were occurring in Maryland's court as to these children or grandchildren of Nellie the Irish woman saying, we ought not to be slaves. Our mother is white. Our great-grandmother was white. Why is this so important, why she's making this claim? Because by 1680, for sure, new laws are coming into place which says actually the persons who would be enslaved, forever, would have to be born of a black woman. So Nellie was being coerced, and more broadly speaking, white women were being coerced not to engage in sexual relations with black men, because in that instance, we would enslave your children. Okay. By the 1700s, a new kind of understanding has emerged. We still do not wish white women to engage in sexual relations with black men. But what we will do is to enslave the children of black women, so that we have a perpetual funnel through which, the slave population could, recycle itself. Of course, if they die, we bring new ones to Africa. But the notion that the white woman can no longer be a producer of slaves, and that the black woman would be the producer of slaves, that is a shift in the idea as, race, and who could be a slave and who could not be. And that's because the children of slaves the children of a white and black person, they mess things up. Because if you make the case of racial purity, that you're white and there's purity there, and that you're black, and that there's something that is essentially, permanent, there's something that is unflinching, unchanging about blackness, what happens when you have someone who's black and white? What do you do with such people? And throughout the 17th century, the 18th century, and into the 19th century, Berlin makes the point that race changes over time, but the struggle to define what to do with the children who are of black and white, it is never truly resolved. Because in some cases they are enslaved, in other cases they are not. And if you are black and free, you have laws in Maryland which says, if you come into Maryland and you don't leave within 10 days, we would enslave you. So you could be free, and then you lose your freedom. But of course we also have laws which manumit, which free the enslaved, where those who are the fathers of children of black and white could decide, in my last will and testimony, I'm going to free this person who is actually my child, or maybe someone I like. Okay, and so there's a fluidity that exists in this whole notion of race at the very beginning and throughout the history of North America, that there's a core sense that people hold that black is black and white is white. But in fact, if you go back to the very beginning of enslavement here, okay, we had white people in Maryland and in Virginia, you were what we call indentured servants, and to all intents and purposes, they were slaves. They could be bought, they could be sold, they could be kept in perpetuity as bondsperson for those persons who were their owners, and so on. Okay. Over time, that changes, and blackness becomes the main criteria through which enslavement, is legitimate. But because we have children of black and white who dance between the categories slave and free, okay, for the history of race in North America, there is never a truly fixed understanding of what to do with that class of people. So on the one hand, I agree with Berlin entirely that race as a category is invented and gets reinvented. But it seems to me that in the instance of the children of black and white, that at no time in the history of North America, if we use, say, Haiti, for example, just to as a comparative kind of comparative position, in Haiti they actually freed the children of black and white. Some of them became plantation owners. In the United States, they moved back and forth. Because whether you were in Haiti, whether you were in the United States, whether you were in Barbados, no one truly understood what to do with that category that simply dissolved the idea of, blackness as being fixed and whiteness as being fixed. And so race as a category is always changing, if only because human beings, black and white, they interact, they have children, and then that explodes the myth of racial purity on either side. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move on to Dr. Levy.
Gananath Sakari, the anthropologist, wrote about survival cannibalism on British vessels, and he talked about how they would always have a randomizing process. They would draw lots so that it was always fair who we were going to eat when we were stranded at sea. Always had to have a fair process. And they always end up with the African or the Polynesian or the single man or the Irishman. They always end up somehow randomly landing on the person who's different in some way. So, difference is so important to this. So I love what you said about that. So I want to start by saying that, I'm going to say something very carefully. I do not speak for the University of South Florida, so my utterances are not representative of the university that employs me. I say that not casually. I come to you from a state that has speech restrictions about what we're allowed to say about race. These things are codified in law, and there's a lot of uncertainty about that. So it's very important that we recognize that. It's significant that what is not prohibited is performance. You can perform race. There are many different ways to engage with race. It's speech that's restricted. And that's deeply significant because so much of what represents the perpetuation, the continuation of the idea of race, the idea of a sort of human categorization with one particular group at the top of a hierarchy and all others in one way or another below, the way that is perpetuated significantly is through speech, the way we continue to interact, the way we continue to think and talk. So it's fascinating that the law would focus on what we say about race and want to restrict that. It's a fascinating way of sort of trying to maintain one particular vision of what race should be. I would urge you to take a look at Barbara Jean Field's work on this. She's got a wonderful discussion with her sister about what they call racecraft. And the analogy that they use is witchcraft. That's brilliant little thinking, because what they argue is that witchcraft is a fiction that can be read onto the human body. And so if you know the study of 17th century witchcraft, 16th century, 17th century witchcraft, there are markers on the body. There are skin tags, there are all sorts of little physical attributes that can be found on the body and are read in the 17th century as markers of witchcraft. So they treat race as basically the same thing. It's a fiction that can be read onto the human body. So their argument sort of builds on the idea of witchcraft as a parallel. So how we talk about this is crucial for its perpetuation, the way it keeps on being instantiated and reinscribed again and again. So let me give you an example from some of the work that I'm doing right now. I should point out quickly, just by way of noting, that I'm going to talk about the Washingtons. That's not a surprise if you know me. But The door here and the door over there are echoes of the Palladian window at Mount Vernon, which itself was a copy from Maryland. So, you know, there you go. But this becomes an architectural fetish, and you find it everywhere. So these are always sort of acknowledgements of Washington. So it's always fun to see them and kind of know what they are. And once I've called your attention to them, you're going to see them everywhere because they're all over the place. And that style becomes very much part of American architectural stories. So John Washington, who's the first member of that family with that name, obviously the first ancestors of George Washington were Marylanders who began here and then crossed over in the 1650s to Virginia. But John Washington is the one with the name, and he's the one who biographers tend to land on. He is the first person in that area of Virginia, in Westmoreland County, to participate in enslavement. How he gets there is a little unclear. He has connections to Barbados, which is where the first enslaved people are coming from. As John Coombs has demonstrated, are transshipped. They arrive in Barbados, they stay sometimes for days. They're not brought into the Barbadian slave system. They are often Africans who are retransported directly to Virginia. You have to know certain people to be able to buy slaves in the 1650s and 60s and 70s. You have to be kind of in a circle of trade. And John Washington was in that circle. We know that he's enslaving people in the 1670s because he brings up a woman named Cole on a slander charge and goes to court because she calls him, and forgive me, but this is the phrase that's in the documents, she insults him as being an ass driver of Negroes. And what exactly is meant by that is unclear, but it's an insult and he's aggrieved by it. But it's an indication in the records that he's already enslaving people by the early 1670s. At the time of his death, there are at least 10 enslaved Africans in his orbit. Some of those people may have come through his second and third marriages. It's not entirely clear. Maybe we'll get some clarity. But what's interesting about this is that that story looks a lot like what you'd see happening all over the Chesapeake region. The wealthiest people, the people with the best trade connections, are entering the African slave trade. There are only a few ways you can do this. As I said, you need specific kinds of merchant connections, either with a merchant who's doing the trade themselves, very few people are, but there are some, or someone who is in one of the places where the trade is functioning well, like Barbados, where you can get people from. And that's what John is doing. His son, John Jr., the more obscure of the two brothers, Lawrence Washington is the much more famous one because his son, Augustine Washington, I can't believe I know this stuff, right? His son, Augustine Washington, was George Washington's father. So there's a brother, and the brother is not as well known. But there's a fascinating thing that happens with the brother. He marries a woman named Anne Wycliffe, who's a local. He lives his entire life over on pretty much the area where the National Park Service now has the George Washington birthplace, National Monument, and lives pretty much his whole life there. And Anne Wycliffe is from that place also. She's the daughter of a guy named David Wycliffe, who has a huge lawsuit over what's going to happen to one particular enslaved woman. Goes to court twice to secure her possession. Why? The records don't give us an insight. But we're seeing as early as the 1690s exactly how complicated these relationships become, and exactly how the questions of what happens to children who can't simply be defined as African because of parentage, they become fascinatingly problematic, and the law begins to dance around them and try to figure them out. So Anne Wycliffe marries John Washington Jr., and they have a woman who they enslave. She lives on an adjacent property of land, interestingly called Indiantown, right? Just to keep everybody in the mix, right? Keep the colonial story nicely rounded. And her name is Betty. The documents refer to her as Black Betty. And she had a number of children. All of her children are mixed race. They're all listed as being mixed race in the various documents of the 1690s. Something very interesting happens, though, because Anne's brother, something gets a little circular, right? Anne's brother Henry died. And when he died, he had a fascinating will, 1696, I think is the date, a fascinating will, in which he says he's leaving a series of pots and some cloth to Black Betty. Betty is a woman who's enslaved by his sister. It's not someone who's in his orbit, although clearly they're in the same neighborhood. He's leaving pots, some cooking pots and cloth to her. And then he says, she owes me money, and my sister owes me money. That debt is forgiven. She's to take that money, this gets complicated, and acquire 2 enslaved young men, like buy enslaved Africans. And in exchange, she is to free Hugo and Jimmy, who are the sons of Black Betty. So it's a critique of slavery that says, we're still going to do this, I just want these two people removed from this institution. And then he goes further and he says, take the rest of my possessions and sell them and use the money to take care of Black Betty for the rest of her life and her other 5 children who are to be taught the religion, who are to be taught Protestantism. Hugo and Jimmy are to be taught and both given a horse at the age of 21. So it doesn't say it in the documents, but you're all thinking exactly the same thing I'm thinking when I'm reading it, that he is the father of these children. This is a deeply significant woman in this community who's appearing through this. When the inventory happens, when they go through room by room, and they account for the various enslaved people that are in the various parts of the plantation when John Washington died John Washington Jr., about a year after this. They go through and locate where all the different enslaved people are, and none of them have names. There's a mulatto girl who has fits, so she's epileptic. So she's listed that way, and there are 2 old Negroes, right? They use this kind of language. No one has a name, but there's Black Betty listed as a standalone. So the people going through, doing the inventory, understood who this woman was. And here's the thing that kind of is most fascinating in some ways. There's no complaint about any of this. All the indications are that Anne Washington did what she was supposed to do and provided for this woman for the rest of her life. And then she fades out of the record as people do. It's when we think about how this institution is coming into existence in the 1690s and in the 17th century, one model is the understandable model. I mean, this is a deeply cruel, dehumanizing institution, right? I mean, that's not really disputable. But it's fascinating how quickly we get to these problems of interpersonal relations, how quickly the question of what happens to children of mixed relation marriages, mixed race relationships, so to speak, is going to be an issue. It happens instantaneously. There isn't a moment in time where it's sort of like it looks one way and then later on as time goes by. These things are happening from the very beginning. And it's happening in places where parts of the community that are enslaving people are also accepting different statuses for different people. So all of this is by way of saying that the entire notion of the hierarchy that race implies, is fictional. It's made up. It's made up, as we were saying before, within certain circumstances. It comes from certain moments and certain necessities and certain broader practices. What is constant, and historians don't like to talk about constants, we're nervous about saying that something is, universal across time. There's a joke I always think about from an older comedian from the, 80s, named Emo Phillips. Some of you remember him. But he has this line where he says, I used to think the brain was the most interesting organ in the body. And then I thought, look who's telling me this. Right? So I think that's how historians think about constants. It's like, I know that I can talk about universals, but I know also I'm in a particular moment and place and time that might be more comfortable with universals. So we're always a little nervous. But one constant we can assert about human beings is that they are different one from the other. They're different in numerous ways. They're different in height, they're different in eye color, they're different in hair color, and there's a huge range of skin color possibilities. As it's axiomatic, but it's worth highlighting. You can choose to group people by any set of categories that you want. You could pick anything and make that the criteria. But in one particular historical moment, through one particular set of circumstances, one particular difference becomes more important than others. It eclipses the previous important ones, religion being a paramount one. When you look at the early discussions, when you look at the early language of the way Africans and other non-European Christian peoples are talked about, it's always a language of heathen and savagery, right? So that, and there's a constant there. You see that applied to indigenous people, you see it applied in India, you see it applied in Africa. So that is the initial phrasing. And that yields ultimately to another type of phrasing. But there is this arbitrariness, this historical arbitrariness, but it becomes a catch. Because while, I find my students are always very quick to say social construction. It's a term they all know, and they know what they mean. But you have to then turn that around. Because while we no longer would assert, very few of us, perhaps maybe, no one, I don't know, it would not assert a biological reality to race. And we always have to say one thing, just as a side point about race. There is no version of race that isn't a hierarchy. it's always a hierarchy that always places one particular group at the top. There isn't another version. It can't be reversed. You can have prejudices go in multiple different directions, but race doesn't reverse, because race reversed doesn't have the power of the state to support it. It doesn't have the power of religion to support it. It doesn't have the power of science to support it, as it had in the 18th and 19th centuries, early 20th century, which is really the heyday of this kind of thinking, right? So you can't reverse it. You can have prejudice in 360 degrees, but race is always unidirectional. It is a hierarchy with one particular group at the top. There's no other version. So you can play with that and have that, and it can be socially constructed, if you want to use that phrasing. It can be arbitrary. It can be based on categories that in and of themselves really don't mean anything hierarchical. They're just difference, and difference can be read however you like. But once that difference is put in place, once meaning attaches to those differences, something changes, and it stops being simply arbitrary and starts to convey power. And that power can be very complicated. So you can have, as Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's written about, you can have race function in one way. She talks about it as a meta-language for power and difference. It can function in one way as a punishing source, right? It can be demeaning, it can be punishing. People can be on the bad side of the law because of this category. But also it's something that people who have the categories negatively applied to them can use in their own advantage. So she talks about the idea of a race man, somebody who's, in the argot of the early 20th century. Du Bois talks about it this way, that, there's a positive side to this too. It can be used. Once it exists, it can be used. One of the crucial debates, and this is sort of where I'll tie up, one of the crucial debates we're having now in these discussions between people who are, to use Torrey Reed's phrase, think of sort of like race essentialists, right? That see race as the crucial category, and others who see race as essentially a hierarchy, a made-up thing. So some people in their work are emphasizing the power of race and building their theories of interaction around race as a useful category, either to see a language of oppression or to turn around, but others are challenging that and saying we should be stressing the arbitrariness of it. So there isn't a universality, so to speak, in the way it's being talked about. There are, within the scholarship, there's a lot of disagreement, and there's some really interesting debates about how to understand race, all from people who are not trying to validate some kind of 19th century, early 20th century absolutism about race in an older scientific language, but rather are saying, is this useful, and if it is useful, how, versus other people saying that it should be critiqued and ultimately dismissed. So I'll stop there and yield to Julie.
Dr. King.
Thank you, and I just want to say, you both have blown me away with what you have to say, and I wish I had gone first. It's
the danger of preparing comments, right?
And I have these prepared comments because a lot going on this week for me. So I'm going to go ahead and read my comments, but I'm going to try to do it in an engaging manner. Not quite as engaging as my two
She's one of the
colleagues.
best at this, so she's just being falsely humble.
So my remarks for this evening's panel focus on how we can use the region's history, because many of you in the audience know that I work in Southern Maryland and in parts of Virginia. How can we use the region's history and its archaeology to explore the creation and evolution of the idea of race in modern America? How can we take what we know here to these bigger questions? And I want to begin by noting that I am not a scholar of the history of race in America, but I can tell you that anyone who studies Chesapeake history must engage with the role of race in the region's history. To not do so would be malpractice. Race is foundational to American history, whether we accept the fact or not, and American history just cannot be understood in a racial vacuum. And I firmly believe that our nation's reckoning with race, as tough and as hard as it's going to be, is going to propel all of us, I think, to a better future. And this may be what, and I said this to you earlier in the car, and I'll say it here, this may be where the exceptionalism of America lies. I think that this panel came together when Mr. Laporte came across an op-ed written by my colleagues, Professor Emerita Iris Carter Ford, archaeologist Ed Cheney, and me in 2001 that was published in the Baltimore Sun. In that op-ed, the three of us questioned the identity of Matthias de Souza, who many of you may know is pretty famous on campus, an enigmatic individual who had come to Maryland on the Ark and the Dove. We question D'Souza's representation as, quote, the first person of African descent to participate in an English-American legislative body. This representation has been around since at least the 1960s and into the 70s, when a young theater student from Fordham University by the name of Denzel Washington spent a summer in St. Mary's City playing the role of Matthias D'Souza. By the time of Washington's performance in the 1970s, D'Souza had been transformed into an African man voting in a colonial assembly, and this was feeding a long-standing narrative of colonial Maryland as having been racially tolerant. This narrative actually has its origins in the early 1800s, and it wasn't about D'Souza, when writers in that early 19th century were comparing Maryland's colonial experience with that of Virginia, and concluding that Maryland lacked the expensive, violent Indian wars that had plagued Virginia throughout the century. Wars were expensive, and given the political organization of the Maryland colony as a proprietary colony, the Calverts would have had to foot that bill. So they chose to take a path of diplomacy, a historical fact that in the early 19th century was read as a kinder, tolerant place, an example of this racial harmony. The end result, of course, was that was the same, as indigenous people in both colonies were dispossessed of their land, displaced, and marginalized. Now, as everyone knows, and I think we've heard it and from my two colleagues, there is no biological basis for racial categories, even as these categories have a stark reality, or a stark social reality. Racial categories emerged out of the early modern, that is the 15th through 17th century European efforts to make sense of an emerging, at least to them, this emerging new world of social and cultural difference. These early classifications were typically grounded in confessional identity, religion. Charles I had no problem, for example, granting the Maryland colony to Cecil Calvert, quote, in a country hitherto uncultivated. And of course, the indigenous people here were farmers, but he's saying, in a country hitherto uncultivated, in the parts of America occupied by savages having no knowledge of the divine being. So it was not just the English king's right, but his Christian obligation to plant Maryland and cultivate it as God intended. Sure, the indigenous people were people, that had been settled, but they were not Christian. The Enlightenment transformed how people thought about nature and religion's relationship to it, providing the means for the concept of what we might think of as human liberty. Paradoxically, the Enlightenment also provided the vocabulary and a natural or scientific justification for race-based slavery. We sometimes hear people not versed in Atlantic history claiming that Africans and Native Americans enslaved other Africans and Native Americans. I'm sure you've all heard that. Or what is actually a bit of a false equivalency. But the forms of this slavery, indigenous and African slavery, were very different from Atlantic slavery, and I think Gary went through this really well. They were not, these other forms of slavery were not grounded in Enlightenment notions of racial inferiority. By the mid-19th century, researchers working for the Smithsonian were running around measuring, this is in the 1800s, as Maryland's concocting its narrative of racial tolerance. Researchers were working for the Smithsonian were running around measuring native skulls to prove that the amazing mounds in the Ohio heartland were made by a lost civilization and not the ancestors of the indigenous people that were still in the region. How could they have been, the thinking went among these Smithsonian scholars, given how impoverished the region's 19th century indigenous communities were? And this is known as the mound builder myth. Now, anthropologists and historians today scoff at the mound builder myth. We know there was no lost civilization at all, but in fact, we see this legacy persist. For those of you familiar with the famous 9,000-year-old skeleton discovered near Kennewick, Washington, bioanthropologist at the Smithsonian used racial classification science, skull measurements, to determine the skeleton was Polynesian. It was found in Washington State, not Native American. The reasoning was not great science, and by the way, DNA proved the skeleton to be indigenous not only to North America, but to the area from which it was found. In other words, it was connected to the people that were there. Now, this mound builder legacy, or what I'm going to call son of mound builder, it shows that it persists in popular culture, such as in TV shows, and archaeologists are really upset about this right now, so this is in a way why I want to talk about it, that some super race, or even ancient aliens, were responsible for the pyramids or for the ancient cities underground, or for whatever remarkable archaeological landscape we see, and not the ancestors of the usually brown or black people still living in the region whose ancestors built these things. But by interrogating these stories and these claims, and the fact that these TV shows are very popular and never go away, and they're always about lost civilizations and aliens, I mean, it really shows how out in the popular mind that it's a problem, and not just a problem for archaeologists, but I really believe it's grounded in racial ideology. So by interrogating these stories and these claims, and understanding that the origins of racial classification can be found in these earlier centuries, we learn that these classifications are man-made, grounded not in religion or nature, but in culture, and that it is the social and cultural reality of classifications that we should be unpacking and remaking them in an effort to secure these better futures. Part of this deconstruction, of course, has to include the harm done historically and in the present by systems of racial classification, and sweeping it under the rug is no option. And I want to thank the St. Mary's County Historical Society and the Center for the Study of Democracy for pulling this panel together. We all know that this can be a difficult topic to address, with many people wanting the past to stay in the past. Of course, that's not how the past works. The past is always butting in. But if nothing else, if we turn to the past, we turn to history to look for the origins of the world that we live in today, as corny as that may sound, I kept thinking about Colonial Williamsburg, that the future may learn from the past, but maybe there's some truth in that. We can build better tomorrows, and I want to point to my colleagues at Sodderly for what they have done, so thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King, and thank you for all your insightful remarks.
Just to say one thing, apropos of mound builders, everybody knows the interpretation of Easter Island, where these Polynesian people sort of, ate themselves into, built stone statues to the point where they couldn't survive their civilization, killed the last tree to build, this Polynesian self-destruction. Well, what the archaeology shows is that, in fact, the Dutch introduced contagious diseases, and they start dying out, and then the French introduced contagious diseases a decade later, and then the Spanish come with contagious diseases, and by the 18th century, the French are covering the island with sheep, and they're corralling the indigenous people into one corner. The sheep eat all the vegetation. The indigenous people have a subterranean stone-lined farming system that gets killed when the sheep are there. It's just colonization. There's a whole edifice that, this Polynesian people destroyed themselves and becomes this paradise. It's the inverted mound builder, right? It's the same idea.
The mound builder,
Right.
the son of mound builder lives.
Yeah.
So we went a little longer than I had anticipated, so I wanted to see, making sure that we have enough time for the audience, and so I have some questions, but I think it's, we can open it up to the audience just to start off and just jump right into it. So anyone have any questions? We have a microphone here that we will pass around. Please identify yourself and present your question to our panelists. Any questions?
Just, Dr. Levy, can you just elaborate on what you were talking about, the hierarchy that's there and that always has been? Can you just elaborate a little bit more about that?
It's not always has been. It's it's a creation of the 17th century, really. There always are. I mean, you see this with indigenous people. You see this across the world. There seem to often be people who were great And those people over there, they're not so great, right? So you see this in indigenous societies where there's, invariably, terms are for us, but then you get like man-eaters over there, right? So there's often this sort of sense of the community and then the people outside the community. So there is, dichotomy, right? What starts to develop in the 17th century, and it's very complicated, but what starts to develop in the English-speaking world, particularly among Britons, is the sense that there is this male Protestant landholder who sort of sits at the top of the pyramid. That's the optimal thing to be. And everybody else is less in one way or another. Women are less because women in 17th century thought in the English world, Western Europe we could say, are inferior men, right? They're men who fail to develop fully. So they're a little bit less. A boy is less than a man, right? Because he's on the way, but he's along. So there's a Catholic is less because he's Catholic and not Protestant. Someone who may be Protestant and male but doesn't own land is less. So there's a whole lot of different ways. I was thinking of it as like a cone with a top. There's a lot of different ways to be less. And Africans fit into that model of being less. It's just that once you get the transition underway to an African-based labor force in colonial settings, it becomes necessary, first expedient then necessary, to try to control this group of people who, if you don't, you end up with with rebellion, and this is what they live in fear of. So they're always slaveholders are always sort of trying to control this, and generation after generation, you get this sort of development. And it ultimately sort of sticks. It becomes the understanding, but it becomes sort of the most privilege of the many differences. But those differences don't go away. There still is anti-Catholicism. Anti-Catholicism is in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, there still is this very strong sense that this is the better way to be. Anti-Semitism is not in the Declaration, but it's there in people's thinking. So there are many different ways to be inferior. It's just that the economy in certain colonies starts to build itself around this one particular difference, and that one takes on sort of a life of its own.
And that's because race provides a pragmatic solution to the problem of identifying the outsider. Sure, the history of slavery everywhere, the slave is the outsider. But it's difficult to identify the outsider if he speaks the same language, if he looks like you, if he has the same religion, and if you have the same culture. So you have to find ways to identify. So maybe you have to wear a particular kind of clothing so that we can know who you are. There are things that we have to impose upon you to ensure we know who are the people who are eligible for enslavement. But if you look different, and if it's biological, so hereditary enslavement using skin color is pragmatic because it allows a permanent kind of marker as to how to identify the outsider. And with that, I suppose it's a contingency. It occurs at a particular moment in time, and so they use it. Then you have to justify it. And in that justification, ideologies emerge of supremacy and inferiority. But the first vehicle that's been employed here is really, it's one of pragmatism. How do we identify the outsider? Who are we going to enslave?
And I hate to be naive, and I don't want to take too many questions, but it takes too much time. But do you guys know when color-based slavery first began?
Well, if you're from the Caribbean, which I am, okay, and large-scale successful plantation slavery begins in Barbados. Barbados is the first successful plantation slave society anywhere in the world. It then migrates elsewhere. Okay, but in places like Brazil, just in South America, in some of the islands of Africa where the Portuguese, attempted to engage in, sugar plantations and so on. There were earlier efforts to transform Africans into a subservient labor force for the purpose of generating profit. Just didn't work. It worked in Barbados because in Barbados, they found a product which is sugar, which before sugar, what you have as a sweetener, as well known as honey. Sugar is simply better than honey for all kinds of reasons, including making rum. Okay, and so once that happens, you have tens of thousands of people being taken from Africa into Barbados. And so race-based slavery emerges as a permanent kind of fixture to the landscape of the Americas. But it's not the first effort. It's the most successful, and then the dominoes begin to fall. Because these guys have relatives in Virginia, in Maryland, all over the place. And, Barbadian planters colonized Jamaica. When Barbados is only about 155 square miles, Jamaica is 2,000. Cuba is about 40,000. And so you have this kind of domino falling. Once we have found a solution, as Englishmen, as Frenchmen, how to combat Spanish dominance in generating wealth in the Americas. So we can't find gold mines that we have in Mexico and Peru, but we have slave labor, we have sugar, and from that we could generate enormous profits. So we can't give you a specific time when blacks are first enslaved. What we can give you is the specific place and moment where it is successful to such a degree that it becomes the model right to the Americas.
It's an issue of carts and horses, I think, so we could change your question and get closer to the answer, because it's important to understand race itself as emerging from the practice of slavery, not preceding it, right? So there's this perception of difference, it's a lot of difference. Not everybody's going to be put into this category. The crucial distinction, I would argue, has to do with duration. How long do you serve for? Do you serve for a period of time and then you get something at the end of it? Do you attain freedom? There are many different ways you can be an English servant. You can serve by custom of the country. The English courts have the right in the 17th century to round up the children of the landless poor. And they do it. They round them up and they sell them. And they sell them to the colonies. And that person, now then sold, will serve until they're 21. And the county court will oversee their conditions. When they're 21, their servitude ends, and then they can sign a contract and become an indentured servant and serve for another 7 years and maybe get something at the end of that. But there's always a sense that the servitude is going to end. What happens, and it doesn't happen in a progressive or linear fashion. So there are Spaniards in the 16th century, some of whom are grabbing indigenous people. They take them from Florida, they depopulate Florida to bring them to the West Indies. And there's no question that those people will serve in that capacity till they die. But there isn't the notion of race there. These are, grab these people, they're heathens, and they're going to work on my land until they die. And that's that. Now, Spanish slavery is a very different thing because of the intercession of the Catholic Church, which, just one simple example, in the Catholic Church, or in St. Mary's, right? In the Catholic Church, marriage is a sacrament. So the church oversees marriage. So that, this is old, I think Honker wrote about this back in the 50s, right? That the church will intercede to protect the marriages of enslaved people because there's a sacrament to them. In the Protestant world, there's no such thing as a marriage for enslaved people, right? It can't happen. So the whole process there is different, but there will be people who are serving in perpetuity their entire lives. There is, the new work that's emerging is talking about, the older work on this, there are a lot of people, this goes back to Edmund Morgan, Anthony Parent talks about this, that there's the evolution, stresses the evolution of law in Virginia. How you go through a series of steps in law that create the legal category of the slave. The newer work is saying, but they always knew what they were going to do. There's never a moment when they doubt that these people are going to be either enslaved permanently or just that they're never going to be full parts of our civilization. That's never in question. So it's just a question of how you cope with that. So at some point, you're saying, right, well, these people are going to serve in perpetuity. And what you start to notice is, well, tell me what I see about the people who serve in perpetuity. They're all darker than the people that aren't. And that's where you start to get this idea of there being some other difference. You start to look at that world through new eyes, born into that world, and start to say, oh, this must be the natural order of things, right? We do this our own selves all the time. We lose sight of the historical roots of the things around us, and they're just how the world is. And so you get another generation saying, right, well, this must be how the world is. And since this is how the world is, let's write theology that enforces that. Let's do scientific research that reinforces that rests on those premises. Let's write law that rests on those premises. And you close people in. You calcify those categories and solidify them and make them ever more real. So it really begins with a question of duration. Like I said, there are indigenous people who are serving for the rest of their lives, but race isn't there yet. It starts to shift. So if we think of it that way, I think we get closer to it. I hope that helps a bit.
We have a question in the back. Dr. Barno?
Thanks.
All of you for a fantastic discussion so far tonight. I'm giving you a really question.
I like this so far.
Earlier this week, there was a wonderful kickoff event that the state held for American Indian Heritage Month. And at that event, Rico Newman, the Crown Elder of the United Tribe, talked a lot about land acknowledgement. And he was really interested in probing the concept and getting us all to think about land and what it can do for us and what it can do. And I think you talked a lot about the sort of cone-shaped the aspects of racial identity. I wonder if you were to take on the task of looking at land-based view on racial identity and construction of racial identity over time, what would that look like if we were kind of starting from the land instead of, or perhaps in addition to starting from the relationship?
So I'm not sure I can answer. I'll tell you what my mind went to with this question, which is that, you know, it's a commonplace for people to say that indigenous people didn't own land, right? And it's not true. Of course they owned land. They understood that this is mine, right? And they fought extensively for a long time to keep people off that which was theirs. They understood it. What they don't have until colonization is a commodified sense of land. So what they don't have is a sense of ownership of land where the land is alienable, right? That I can now give it to you and I no longer have access to it. Those are all European concepts that come in, and that they're crucial pieces of colonization. We could get into the dynamics of European colonization, but a big part of it is, in most cases, many cases, violently forcing people into positions where they now have to live in that reality. So that's how you get indigenous people who are dislanded, right? There's a guy in the end of the 17th century named Ned. It's Ned the Indian, and he appears in the records over in Westmoreland County a couple times. He's living somewhere over near John Washington's land. There are people there are Europeans, there are English people, Daniel Lisson, for example, who can speak Algonquian. I can't tell you for the life of me, first off, if he really can, like if he's actually any good at this, or how he could have picked up Algonquian, except that there are indigenous people sitting in the edges of this English world. They're invisible, right? They're sort of out of sight. So as you put paper on land, as you take land through the colonial process and change it into paper, change it into systems that then say exclusivity, that this belongs to me and not to you, as is happening in the English world more broadly, right? England is going through a 300-year period of enclosure where the English people themselves are being taught that they don't have access to land anymore. So if they just bring that problem over to the Americas and start doing the same thing, you start to create a class of people, indigenous people in this case, who are dislanded, right? And land is fundamental to survival, it's fundamental to livelihood, it's fundamental to manliness, right? To be able to take care of one's family. And as people are sort of pushed to the margins, then that's another way that they become somehow less, right? And they're there still. Like Ned is there. All I get is the name. But there's a road. This is the road that goes to Indian Ned. He's there. And some of the people around him, some of the English people around him, are conversant enough with indigenous languages. A few people appear in court a couple decades later, 1690, 1710. You get some indigenous people appearing in court, but they're operating very much within the English legal system, which is their only option. That's what colonization does to you, right? Susan Kellogg's work on Mexico is a great example of this, the way you get brought into the system, whether you like it or not. So I don't know if that's exactly what you're shooting at, but it's the land itself, as it becomes a commodity and a central component of the colonial process, it serves to kind of push people off and does the same thing. So, yeah, great question.
I love that you mentioned Indian Ned, because Indian Ned lived on the Rappahannock. And lived in King George County, and we were actually able to figure out where he lived, and he did own land, and Henry Fleet was the one who had him own the land, and he was protected in a way that other indigenous people weren't, because where he was living in Nanzatico territory, one of them had murdered an Englishman, and so all the Nanzatico, the Virginia law was that they would all suffer, they would all be punished, they were all rounded up, marched to Jamestown, except Ned, because he was a landowner.
What's the year? Do you know the year for that?
1705.
Because John Washington is given in 16
All right, we're going to go off on a tangent.
He's given the right to the Netsatical land when those people no longer live there.
Yes, and it's...
And you can
yeah.
imagine him going, okay, yeah, no, I know how
Yeah.
to take care of this, right? So,
Well, they're marched to Jamestown and they're put on a ship to Antigua. But
Right.
but
Great.
Indian Ned, and he's Christian, right? He says he's a Christian man. He writes a will because he actually, in Bacon's Rebellion, goes to quote, and he says, "Fight against my countrymen." So we got to talk.
Yeah.
I didn't realize Indian Ned showed up.
oh, yeah, no,
We're-
he's there's a road to Indian Neck.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, well,
Good question here.
Apologizing for an off-screen.
we're all novices.
Yeah, I wanted to do the horizontal axis is time, and it is the story of slavery and the African experience in the Americas. And on the vertical was something that we might call a human rights success index. There certainly would be a low point at the peak of slavery. I suspect there's a higher point that you might define either with the emancipation or with perhaps even the civil rights movement in the 60s. But I don't know what the shape of that curve would look like over time. And I don't know where it is today.
I think, I probably wouldn't use those, the model of the, of the curve, but I would use linearity. I would use a straight line. I would use a straight line in terms of, where we were, and where we are, and to contemplate where we can be. Okay. And it seems to me that if there's a simplicity there, of course, but it's as to how we contemplate history as a linear process rather than a circular process. Time itself is infinite in that kind of configuration. But as we look back, it seems to me that that we have a privileged moment to compare. And where we are is far better than where we were, it seems to me, which in no means indicate that we are at nirvana. We're not in a perfect place. But the idea that 2022, I'm sitting there speaking to a room which is overwhelmingly white in 2022. I couldn't possibly have a PhD in history, teaching at St. Mary's College and so on. I couldn't possibly be doing this in 1722. As someone like me. And so history permits us, to reflect upon change through time. And how we get there, is obviously a function of struggle of all kinds of different forces and, trying to make the world better. Sometimes winning, sometimes losing. But, I would think when you take the big picture, okay, look back over time, we began, speaking of, 1441, 1664, but we are doing so from the benchmark of 2022. We're in clearly a much better place in 2022 than we were in 1622.
You might be familiar with Edmund Morgan's work on this. If you're not, it might be worth looking at. It's older work, but extremely influential. It looks at the interconnectedness of the notion of slavery and the notion of freedom, right? The two are entwined together. And historians have been playing with this for a long time. But that entwinedness is I think, the crucial thing. I don't know that we can just sort of simply say good, bad, up, down. I think it's much more complicated and much more individual and much more circumstantial. There are some people whose enslavement is better than other people's freedom, and vice versa, right? It's extremely complicated. There's a grave, comes to mind, in Bristol, in England, just outside of town, in a small church, and it was vandalized actually during the George Floyd protests. Somebody decided to smash it, but it's a series of gray graves, stones, and there's one in there. When I saw it, it's painted. Somebody has painted it bright colors. The only one in the cemetery, and it's for an enslaved man. It's the grave of an enslaved man who was, I think it's I don't remember which duke it is, but he's like enslaved by some duke, and it's this gigantic stone. And, you know, his slavery looks so different than anybody you'd see in Virginia, right? So we don't want to say that slavery is good, that would not, but that's precisely why these sort of categories don't work. This is an extremely complicated problem, and there are, you know, there are all sorts of oppressions that take all sorts of forms. Oftentimes what is dehumanizing and marginalizing about slavery is not what people think. I mean, a lot of times, particularly with students, they tend to, something has taught them to focus on things like violence, and then you get a sort of shock disappointment when they find out that maybe it's not as violent as they thought, for example. And then that raises questions for them that probably don't need to be raised. The reality of what makes slavery horrible is its perpetuity, its lack of ability to control one's fate, to control the fate of one's children, right? That's what it comes down to more than anything else. Everyone below a certain class, maybe even at a certain class, in the 17th century is subjected to physical violence. You know, the 17th century, you're going to be beaten. That's going to happen. You're going to be branded. Your ears are going to be cut off. Your nose is going to be cut off. You know, there's all your hands are going to get branded. You're going to get your ear nailed to the stocks. There's all sorts of things that they do in the 17th century. It's a brutal time, and enslaved people are treated brutally within that context also. But so are servants, and so are all sorts of people. So if you look for brutality, this is the danger of an index, right? If you look for brutality, you're going to find all sorts of people being brutalized. And then that's going to leave you saying, oh, well, maybe, you know, you're going to come up with the wrong conclusion. The issue is perpetuity. The issue is control of one's fate and life. And then generationally, the inability to control. The long-term effect on not just individuals, but communities of individuals as they are unable to steer their fates.
But it is precisely because of those long-term effects that we can gauge how they have changed. If we are in the Caribbean, you know, in Jamaica, in St. Vincent, Barbados, in all of these places, and perhaps in the United States, the collective wisdom that we have distilled out of that experience is that where we are today is far superior than where we were in 1834, the very 1st August 1834, when slavery ends in the Caribbean, and so on. And so it is true that you could find, you know, moments of tenderness, okay, moments of brutality. You could find all of these things, but if you're speaking collectively, over the vast range of the human experience over a couple of hundred years, and I try to make sense, you know, not at the level of the individual, but of the broader society and where we were versus where we are, then you still, you know, you still have to acknowledge that in that search, that pursuit of freedom, that pursuit of a better life, that control of your destiny, that you're not that you're not commodified, that you have control of your children and all these kinds of stuff. It's a very different world than today than where you were in Barbados in 1675, and so we're aware that we do not live in a perfect world, nor can we say that every single moment during enslavement was somehow, you know, this abyss, you know, this terror, because human beings still have to try to make sense of their world, find happiness in the world, you know, still play, still love, to do all of these things even during slavery. So all these things are true. So the maintenance of one's humanity is true whether a slave or free. But when you look at the collective experience of people, you know, who are the descendants of slaves, and you march through time to say, okay, how do we, you know, make a comparative analysis? If comparisons have any value, okay, over time, then you still end up in a position that I would rather be here now than in the year 62 in Barbados.
Anything, right? That goes to something Julie said about, you know, learning from the past and, you know, where exceptionalism might rest. And, you know, we don't often think of it this way, but it's useful, and we probably should, that we are among the most fortunate humans that have ever existed on the planet.
That is correct.
And we don't talk about that. I would say, you know, as a Jew in the United States in this moment, with longevity and nutrition and relative freedom, you know, we were among the most fortunate Jews ever to have existed. Even though I was raised in a world that was in the shadow of the Holocaust, and these issues were there, ever present, there was absolutely a sense that this is, you know, the most amazing thing. What we lose sight of is its fragility. that it doesn't, the thing about this achievement is that it can vanish instantly.
It's not guaranteed.
There's no problem, no hand of God sits over this and says,
Yeah.
this, thus it will always be. And it doesn't take much for the rug to simply be pulled out from under us and us to fall into barbarism. It has happened so many times historically. Beautiful, elaborate, crenellated, just, fortunate civilizations have turned on themselves, have consumed themselves, have and within a decade, within a generation, are just beating each other with sticks again. It happens again and again. The fragility of what we have, maybe in some ways, is the right thing to think about, right? Sure. That's sort of bloodless sounding, but yeah. But I think that's a really important thing, and maybe in some ways that's a thing to consider, that can be foisted on any of us. It can change on us in a heartbeat.
But the notion that the future is unknowable is I think it's well founded. That's why we can compare where we are versus where we were, but we can't speak with any kind of authority about tomorrow because that is continuously in the making. What we do now creates tomorrow, but tomorrow isn't given to us. We have to create it.
Let's try to get to one more question.
So this has been very enlightening, and it's sort of that historical perspective to tell us how we got to where we are, but how can we use that to move forward? How can we use it in a constructive way to make that better world, to sort of make it not as fragile? Or do we just learn the lessons and sit here doing nothing?
Well, I would say vote. Tuesday. But I think that it's just as everything is fluid and we are always in a state of becoming. I know that I've spent a long time, many years, studying the history of this region, and I feel that there's so much that I have learned. And I believe that for the general public who may not have jobs doing archaeology, that this is where places like museums and historic sites become really important, because we need to have, and historical societies, we need to have conversations that are going to be tough. If you all remember when Clinton was president, he tried to create some of these discussions. I know some of you probably weren't around when Clinton was president, but and they didn't work. And we keep talking about it. I think we're moving in that direction. But I think that there's been a lot of talk about critical race theory and how it shouldn't be taught, and that it makes people feel guilty. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what I do, and certainly I think of what you guys do as historians, archaeologists, anthropologists in my class. It's not about making people feel guilty, but it's about making people understand what happened and try to understand how that came to be. I don't think we do. I do think our futures are unknowable, but I think, and we know that our futures are unknowable. Things can happen, right? People are in car accidents. But we can work towards instead of just abdicating, work towards building a better future where we really consider some of the things that we don't even necessarily know that we need to consider. I mean, I've had conversations with people whose privilege is so embedded that it's going to take a lot of work. And I probably was one of those people at one time. I mean, and maybe still am. So I think that that's where, looking to history is a really important thing, and that the place for non-archaeologists and non-historians is in our public spaces where we talk about this. I feel like I'm babbling.
No,
I'm not nearly as articulate as my colleagues.
The fundamental danger, the reason people would want to silence discussions of history, is because history is dangerous. It's radical. All of it. Because its sort of core point is that things were different once. And the second part of that sentence is, and they'll be different again, right? And that's the danger. So the more invested people are in the status quo, the less they're going to want open inquiry into the past, because they're going to want to sort of create histories that will lead only to where the status quo is. So, one thing we can do, self-serving, right? But one thing we can do is think critically about the past, recognizing that our present is historically contingent. It's created by historical forces, and it doesn't exist naturally. It doesn't just happen. Almost everything we know, all of our categories, most of our understanding is historically contingent and comes from some set of processes that got us here. And if we can recognize that, then we can say, all right, well, what can we think differently about? How can we think differently about these different systems that whatever they are, in any direction? But recognizing that because they changed, they can change again, and they do change again. Almost everything we take for granted and know to be true, they'll be laughing at in 500 years of human civilization still here. We're going to look like barbarians. There's just no way around that. That's in the same way we look back at the 16th century and marvel at how you lived with intestinal parasitosis. It's what you must have smelled like, right? It's going to be the same. Right? We don't know yet what our weaknesses are, but we have them. We're doing them. We're performing them all the time. That kind of cultural broad self-awareness, I think, might give us a little bit of caution and make us sort of a little more careful in things we do. I think.
There is no value in amnesia. To ask us to forget the past, I mean, how do we as a society make a step forward without knowing exactly where we are and where we were? Amnesia at the individual level, amnesia at the collective level is without value. In fact, it's quite dangerous. We get lost.
Great. Well, I think we're just about out of time. I think one of the fascinating insights from this discussion is how our history is important, but it's also important for understanding how and the nature of our society today, and in particular in regards to race and racial identity. But there's a lot that we haven't covered today, and right, thinking about how race and racial identity and the formal structures around race impact federal policy or state governmental policy.
You're the political scientist.
So that's part two of this discussion, and at another day, another historically speaking event, to think about how race impacts laws and policymaking, and how that shapes, how that feedback affects with society and our communities, but it's also important to think about how history informs that. One of the things that each of you mentioned was that history is fluid, and that there's a social component, but a historical, a temporal aspect to it, and that it's constantly evolving. And as we're having this discussion, I couldn't help but think how this is especially relevant in our country today, with the increasing diversity that we are witnessing, racial, ethnic, and then everything in between, and how our formal classifications of race, how well, to what extent they keep up with those changes, and I don't think that they are, and I think we're witnessing that in our society. But that's maybe for another conversation, part two of the conversation. We'll see what we can do. With that, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. Let's thank our panelists. They will stick around for a minute or two after we're done here, so if you have additional questions, you can pose those questions to them. We have food that is still here, so please help yourself, coffee, tea, whatever else. And on behalf of the St. Mary's County Historical Society and the Center for the Study of Democracy, thank you for coming out tonight. Have a good evening.